Ready to move to the next level in your product career? I'm Shobhit from Intentional Product Manager. Join me as we discuss ways to help you stand out in your job search and your career so you can have more impact and make more money. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Intentional Product Manager podcast, where we help you fast track your product career, help you reach your potential. That's our goal. So today's guest is someone who I've been meaning to get on the show for a while now, Kunal Thadani. Kunal is currently the Senior Director of Product at Houzz, with past experience at companies like The League, House Pro, and advising across AI and SaaS through his work at the Insider Growth Group, which we'll talk about a bit as we go along. He's helped scale product teams, grow ARR by tens of millions, and move up market with precision. Really what excites me about this podcast and this conversation is how tactical and repeatable his thinking is. Like, he's written articles and other things which I've followed. So Kunal, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, and kind of excited to dive deep and be as tactical as we can.
Let's start with some warm-up questions. I always love to throw some fun questions in, and then we'll go into the deeper topics. When you think of your first product management role, what's one thing you wish you could go back and tell yourself?
I'll upgrade that to maybe two or three things. One is, I think when, I started my PM career, I thought it was all about coming up with, the best idea, the most innovative idea. And thinking kind of back, I think one thing would be, don't try to impress with ideas, but try to impress with impact. What is the impact you can have as a PM on the bottom line of the business? I think second is, I think your first job or, mid-stage or early career in your product, I think it's really learning, don't getting so sucked into your product area, what's your roadmap, what is your list of initiatives, but your job is to really learn, how does a business make money? What converts the user, and how does your pod actually impact the bottom line? And then in terms of I think the last thing is, I think there's always a balance of quality and speed. And what I've seen historically work really well is, in kind of in your product career, building trust is really important, right? With your stakeholders, with your exec team, with your, direct cross-channel teams, that I actually think speed of execution actually builds credibility much faster than perfection.
I especially resonate with drawing that line to how it affects the business, because it was something I was blind to when I was in my first product management role. Now let's talk about the other side. So you've been on both sides, leading teams and then also advising startups and founders, and especially as they're thinking of bringing on product managers. What's something that maybe founders misunderstand about product management?
Probably two things, right? So I think what I've seen is founders will hire a PM when they need the first PM, when they need someone to execute kind of a backlog of ideas. And I think one kind of misunderstanding is PMs don't own the roadmap, they own outcomes, right? They own what should the user feel and what should the overall kind of user experience be. So I think that's one thing, right? I mean, I think if you're going to hire, your first PM, don't think of it as getting someone in here to ship faster, take a backlog of 100 ideas, prioritize it, but to really give them the baton to own some metric and the outcomes of your company. And I think second is, I've kind of seen a lot of kind of discussion around, bringing a PM in. It tends to either slow down processes. It sometimes adds complexity. You can take 11 labs, right? I think they're set up in a way where it goes straight from go-to-market teams directly to engineering, right? And it kind of cuts out this middleman. And I think how you should basically think about it is, a PM is not coming in to, just set structure, set rules, but the best PMs are actually coming in to simplify decisions without adding, complexity. And I think those are probably two, misunderstandings I've kind of seen when talking to a lot of founders.
Totally resonates with me. I remember having a conversation with the founder and they wanted to bring a PM. And I basically asked him, hey, are you willing to give us some control over what goes in? And he was like, maybe, maybe you should not bring a PM in. One last warm-up question. What's one ritual or practice you've developed that helps you stay grounded and sharp as a product leader?
I think it's probably more of a practice early on in my product career. I think, once I had the roadmap, the list of initiatives, it would go straight into execution of it, right? And in my eyes, it felt like, hey, if I shipped 80% of this roadmap, I would be, I would consider it a success, right? But I think later in my career, kind of what I've learned a lot is if you're not designing the go-to-market of who's this for, how will they actually hear about it? Can you actually get go-to-market teams, sales and customer success to actually adopt this and push this through check-ins, through new sales conversations? What will actually convince them to, take this action? So I think what I do a lot is, especially with medium to larger features, is designing and really writing down what the go-to-market is and getting pre-alignment with go-to-market teams, with teams that own maybe those surface areas that you may not necessarily own, and ensure that you're actually giving this feature, a chance at being successful. I think you never want to be in a place where, you're creating a feature factory where you're, pushing out features that, don't get adopted. You're measured by just velocity, right? And I think the practice of really writing down the go-to-market and getting pre-aligned, I think really ensures that and really increases the confidence and success of every launch that you have. And I've kind of brought that mindset to, my team and kind of the greater org at Houzz.
We're going to talk about two big areas. One is how you get your first big win as a new product manager. And second, we're going to dive into some of the work you're doing, Kunal, in developing new growth-focused skill sets using the Litmus framework. So I'm curious to hear about that as we go along. So let's start at the beginning. So you're handed a roadmap, a vague idea, team's still trying to get to know you, figure out who you are, how you work, all these things are happening. What is your approach to identify and landing that first win?
I think one is the first thing I think as a PM is really starting with, regardless of where you are in terms of say you own some downstream metric on maybe secondary engagement, right? But, maybe for this example, we can kind of talk about, your product team that owns more, top of the funnel product areas. So I think the first thing is really breaking it down to first principles and creating a revenue equation for your specific pod, right? So for example, say you own, all landing pages, pricing and packaging, say you're owning new sales, really breaking down new sales into every specific variable, right? It could be, number of visitors times the sign up rate, times the profile completion rate, times the onboarding completion rate, then kind of getting down to pricing page views, and then checkout conversion. That could be basically a very simplified equation. And I think how I think about this is creating a revenue equation for, a lot of products already have baked in personalization, right? So you might have multiple ICPs, ideal customer profiles. You will want to string together a revenue equation across all the different segments that have a different, path that come to your product. Second, obviously, is a, new PM, right? I mean, dog food the product as much as you can, create a presentation, present it back to, your cross-channel teams, just so you have a strong kind of foundational understanding. And then I would kind of think about it in, there's building something net new, right? But then there's also just optimizing what already exists before actually building more, right? So I would actually focus on the latter bucket, which is what exists today where you feel like the user, we're not prioritizing their job to be done, or we are not reducing cognitive load, or we're not personalizing as much as we can, right? And we'll kind of go through this deeper, but what I've kind of seen through my experiences is probably 8 to 10 different growth levers, and thinking through the lens of, those growth levers to really identify where can you make their journey much easier. So that's more, the brainstorming part of it. And then I would say the last part is, tactical kind of execution, right? But I would kind of identify low lift and high impact, and obviously, quick speed to market. But those are probably a couple of things I would, think about as I think about, PM kind of looking to get their first win in a new role.
And it seems you're between the lines saying that don't go for something that's like major, huge change when you're first joining a team.
Exactly, yeah.
Tell us more. Why should somebody not go for that?
Early on in your tenure at the company, right? I think it's all about building trust with everyone, right? And I think a big piece is building trust is impact, right? And if you're going to, ship something over the course of 4 to 6 months, you're kind of working and walking on eggshells until then, right? And I think you haven't really fully built trust until you have a charter of at least like three or four wins. You've unlocked a new lever that can actually, you can actually create a roadmap around that new growth lever that you've kind of created for the company. So I think a big piece would be that. And I think second is, I think there's a lot of, opportunities kind of, hiding in plain sight. And I think going back to my original point, right? I think it's about owning the outcomes and less about thinking about, big ideas, because I think ideas are a dime a dozen, right? And I think especially now with AI, right? I mean, having a brainstorming partner, I think makes it even easier to kind of have that like innovative chops that used to be, I think, much harder to acquire.
Let's talk about this a bit more. So like when you look at Houzz, when you look at advising companies, what are some patterns that you're looking at when you're trying to find these like low lift, high impact wins?
Look at all your traffic. Are there nested personalization that we can do? And we can kind of go into that deeper. I think second is there like an action that you can take on behalf of a user that will make it easier for them? And we're kind of calling this the power of default, right? So if you know that collaboration, like there's going to be a lot of value in collaboration on your platform, and your seat-based pricing, could you actually default seats at checkout? Because you know that they're going to get a lot more value, and usually within a free trial, they're not actually incurring a cost until the end of the 14 or 30-day free trial. Obviously, there's, I think second is, as you're kind of dog fooding, are there areas where you can reduce cognitive load and really design the experience through first principles? And then I'd say another, low lift, high impact is, I think, copy and sequencing, right, of the flows. And we can kind of go into this deeper. But that's kind of, I think, a hit list of probably 4 or 5, things I've kind of seen across, my experience and advising.
Do you have any case studies or like some examples you could share that maybe like brings this to light?
Yeah, let's go through maybe 4 or 5. So I think the best first wins, right, are move a revenue or revenue adjacent metric, right? like we kind of talked about, low lift. And they help build trust with leadership, engineering, cross-channel teams, right? So kind of going back, right? So I think the first one is, one, we can kind of go through like 4 or 5 levers, right? So one is power of defaults, right? So this is basically defaults that, change behavior without actually asking users to think, which is exactly what you want, pretty early on. So I think one, I kind of chatted with someone, that worked at Uber, but specifically Uber Health. So Uber Health is healthcare rides. So uh, the hospital would basically call an Uber ride on behalf of the patient. The patient would, find the Uber car, and then, get into the car and then arrive at their destination. So what they had actually identified is, healthcare rides had a much, much lower completion rate than normal kind of consumer and passenger rides. And as we kind of think about completion rates, it's basically the funnel from, calling the ride to, the ride actually reaching to their end destination. And it was much lower. It was probably close to like 60 to 65%. So 30 to 35% of rides, never actually made it to their end destination. So what they actually, and you can kind of think about the experience, right? Or the user, right? The user is much older. They may have just come out of an operation or some sort of, medical procedure. It might be a little hazy. But you can kind of think about the different let's kind of get deeper at the micro interactions where, say the Uber ride has arrived, right? So they found out top of the funnel, there was no problem, but the Uber driver has arrived at the destination. Then it's a lot around, okay, like finding the passenger. Okay, if you can't find the passenger, the driver will, call the passenger, and then maybe look at them on the map, try to find them, and then the driver will basically get in, and then drop them at the destination. So I think what was happening was they just applied the same consumer framework where they defaulted a lot of these actions to driver discretion. And what they found out was 2 things, right? So one was when they actually arrived at the destination, it would take a action on behalf of the driver and automatically place a call to the patient or the rider. So that's kind of the default behavior. Instead of allowing the driver to make the decision, should I call the patient or not, it would automatically call the patient when they're 2 minutes, 2 minutes away from the destination to ensure that they come out of the hospital, they come to maybe the parking circle. And this by itself had a 15% increase in ride completion. So I think that was kind of one case study.
I like how thinking through just changing the default is super powerful. I'm eager to hear more.
So I think second is personalization is another growth lever, right? And that it's been around for a long time, right? I mean, I think people have, identified, hey, you're acquiring people through referrals. Their path should be very different. Or you're acquiring them through, SEM for specific keywords. You know which feature they're coming in for. You should personalize the journey to really match that, right? The full journey from purchasing, landing, checking out. And then something interesting was what they did at Betterment. So Betterment is a fintech company. They have a huge kind of financial suite of products. And what they had actually identified was on their main landing page, they had found a correlation of the location of where the sign-up CTA was, that it highly correlated to a user's fund rate so that they would actually fund their financial account. So what that meant was, if people signed up from the top CTA, which is usually, in the hero section, they had a very high sign up rate and a high fund rate. And this was probably users that had high brand affinity, already heard of the brand. These are like your highest intent users. Then there's a second group, right? Users that bounced, immediately. And then I would say, the third kind of group here is users that signed up in the middle or bottom of the landing page. They had actually engaged but wanted more research. So what they actually identified initially, what had happened was the flow after you clicked any of the CTAs would lead to the exact same onboarding. But what they had kind of redesigned was the top CTA would go directly to selecting your account and funding the account. If you signed up from the middle of the landing page, it would actually, you needed research, but you were pretty sold on it, right? Maybe it was more about product selection or discovery, right? So the first step right after hitting the CTA was a quiz to really understand their needs, preferences, and really gave a financial recommendation prior to signing up, right? So you already had your account, recommended, and then you're signing up with the intent of, hey, this is the best account for me, which kind of match their intent. And then I would say at the bottom is, skeptical users. They needed a lot of evidence to actually sign up. And over here, if people actually, click the CTA at the bottom, they would take them to in-depth, product info, FAQs. It was really like a research-based signed out experience that would prior to signing up. And with kind of this segmented and kind of personalized experience, they actually had a double-digit increase in fund rate, which was, I think two things. One is, you're personalizing at the very, very top of the funnel, where most people actually think you can only personalize once a user has given you information, right? Or you have an acquisition source. But this was like a very interesting way of personalizing because probably 50-60% of your traffic, you actually have no information on them when they actually land on your main landing page. So you're tackling like a very large segment at the very top of the funnel. So had a huge impact downstream.
Once you explain it, it all makes sense. But I would have never guessed this, just, hey, the location of the sign up page and which one you actually clicked would have an impact on this. So it's pretty counterintuitive unless you understand the rationale behind it. Give me one more example. This seems very, very interesting.
Yeah, so let's maybe go through Don't Make Me Think, right? So how I kind of think about this growth lever is you're just reducing as much cognitive load by prioritizing and building from a first principles approach, right? So maybe the company here we can kind of talk about is TikTok. So TikTok, kind of their goal for this new product was, how do we get more creators? So, obviously they started off with a lot of like short form content, but they'd launched a new product for more long form content. And they were really figuring out, how do we get more creators to enroll in this long form content? How do we actually get them to, generate income, adoption? Because they thought from a trends perspective, this was, this could obviously increase session length and overall revenue for TikTok. And what their kind of original flow was, is basically like know your customer, so identity verification. Then it was connect your bank account. Then it was, get approved to be a long form creator. And then you would basically start creating content on the platform. I guess, could you identify where the problem was in kind of their existing, adoption flow? Yeah. Yeah. So it's basically, I think the question they really asked themselves was, why does someone need to verify and like connect any bank account prior to actually creating content? Like their job to be done when they came to this landing page or screen in the app was, hey, I'm interested in long form content. Just let me create, and and if it does well, then yeah, I can set up the my financial accounts and go through my know your customer flow. But they basically like turned the whole flow on its side, and they said, hey, you come here, you can opt in, and you can just start creating long form content. And then once you actually have money in your bank account, that will then serve as a carrot. So say you have $5, you've created 5 long form reels to generate that. You're not going to leave $5 on the table, right? You're going to actually go through the verification, your bank information. And that by itself, just flipping with, prioritizing really their job to be done, right? And building a flow based on what the user was excited to do at that moment ended up leading to about a 25% increase in enrollment rates based on the landings that came on their page.
It's pretty interesting, and I would not have been surprised if it was even more, given it's such a huge friction point that you're putting up front before the user has had deep experience with the product. Thank you for sharing those examples with me, Kunal. Let's jump into something that you and Gaurav Hardikar recently shared that's gaining a lot of traction. So you call it the Litmus framework. For those that are new to it, can you give us like a quick summary of what it is and why it matters?
Yeah, so how I would kind of think about it is it's basically a framework to, one, prioritize decision speed and speed of execution, right? And you can kind of think back to chemistry back in high school, where you had to test acid kind of levels of a liquid. You had to test the litmus value, and obviously it was more, you're testing, how acidic it is, right? And how we kind of thought about it is, how can you apply the similar approach in the product realm, right? So how can you move faster with confidence? It combines basically, instead of building, more complex like data science models to optimize everything, how do you combine napkin math and incorporate, a lot of things that other frameworks don't, right? So what is the risk of this feature with, if you were to launch it, what would the risk have on your existing user base, not just like your net new user base? And then another kind of unique variable here is the exec buy-in. As you know, right? I mean, there's features that your exec team don't care about, the ones that they will, shoot down. Should you even prioritize a feature that will, get shot down? And I would say why it matters is it really prevents, one, overscoping. It really forces that revenue math pretty early on in your journey or in your product development cycle. And it helps like make trade-off decisions explicit for leadership and prioritizing your largest revenue driver, which is, your existing user base. And I would say this framework can be applied any part of your product development cycle. It could be applied, during solution prioritization, your quarterly or biannually roadmap planning, or just, you're kind of educating and teaching cross-channel teams and creating a team culture about it. But that's kind of at a high level what it is. And, we can kind of go through an example later.
So I was going to switch the order of the question. So love to hear an example, like how did you use it for a real growth project?
So since the kind of audience knows about, the Uber health example, right? So with every problem, right, you have multiple solutions, right? There's 10 plus, 20 plus solutions, right? And how do you get down to, prioritizing, right? And one big thing about Litmus is you don't always have to go to EPD, engineering, product design, to build every feature or every solution. The key of this is you should be able to go to paid acquisition. You should be able to go to customer success. You should be able to go to other operations teams, maybe even data science, or operations or data science, to design solutions, right? So going back to the Uber healthcare example, the problem they were solving was how could we have better coverage of notifications so we can actually find the end patient, get them in the car, right? So I think different approaches, right? So one is you can automatically send a text to the patient 2 minutes early. That's potentially one that would, you could either handle it through some sort of operations team that sets up a Zapier that could trigger, on behalf of the driver to their end rider. So that's probably more of like an operations focused initiative. Second one was you could build it. This would be more EPD, but you could notify the driver to manually call the patient. So send them a reminder, right? And then I would say like 3 is what we kind of went through, which is call the patient automatically, through the driver's, mass kind of Uber phone number, and kind of going through the math, right? A lot of these have their pros and cons, but the overall equation is it's like the napkin math times 1 minus the resourcing impact, which you can kind of think about as the dev cost. So obviously the higher the dev cost, it's going to bring down the overall equation. Then I would say the second or third piece of the equation is 1 minus the risk to existing revenue. So if we were to kind of launch this, would we see churn from existing users? Would it be a bad user experience? Then I'd say the last variable is like the percentage exec buy-in, right? So if that's really low, the outcome of this formula is gonna be really low, right? So quickly kind of running through this, you can kind of assume that, obviously the napkin math we can say is $100,000 if you automatically called the patient. You'll have max coverage, low costs to the business to develop a solution. You can say notifying the driver to manually call. I think obviously the napkin math will be much lower because instead of 100% coverage of all rides, it might be closer to like 40%. So you can assume the napkin math here is like 40K. And then texting the patient 2 minutes early through some sort of Zapier approach. I think here it's interesting, right? I mean, it's kind of more of like a feature market fit problem, right? I mean, do these older patients actually use text because they're getting push notifications today, but the completion rate for these rides are much lower, right? So you're leveraging a similar mechanism. So I would assume that napkin math is much lower here. Maybe it's 20,000, right? And then you can kind of go through the resourcing impact. These are all pretty very, very low lifts, right? They're all, probably less than a week of either dev or operations time. And then you can kind of go through the risk to existing revenue, potentially the notifying the driver to manually call. It could distract the driver, lead to worse kind of user experience.
Yeah.
You might see slightly more, negative risk to kind of existing revenue there. And then the exec buy-in, right? I mean, I would say this particular example, I wouldn't say there's, I would say probably exec buy-in, you'd probably see a lower exec buy-in for notifying the driver to manually call, just because, it's impairing, safety is probably, is one of their core pillars. But then what you would do is just multiply all those things together to kind of get to, defaulting and, calling the patient automatically. But that's like one particular kind of example that brings it to life.
I really like how you've explicitly even brought in, hey, what's the probability of exec buy-in behind this thing? And make that like a very explicit thing in the decision-making criteria.
Yeah, I think that's probably one key piece that's, very different from, say, Rice or Moscow. I think another one outside of like decision and kind of execution speed, I think the three things that you're prioritizing, right? I think one is like the cycle time between results. Like, hey, you see a failed or successful result, you can quickly, pivot. I think the biggest piece is test ownership. Before, initiatives and tests only belong to engineering and product and design resources. But now that ownership is spread across teams and people feel way more bought in with the roadmap, right? Now customer success can own some of your initiatives, growth marketing, and obviously product eng, design, data science, sales operations, right? So I think it creates a lot more excitement for everyone.
Anytime you introduce something new, like a new framework, a big part is getting buy-in for it. So how did you get buy-in for Litmus?
So I think how I kind of explained it is what kind of, I think Litmus does, right, is, so you can kind of think about it, it wins on decision and execution speed. I think solution depth is not as high, right? You're not building full-fledged features for every problem, right? But I think what I kind of really talked about is how do we get more wins and how do we increase our success rate, right? So let's take like a dartboard, right? You throw 100 darts and maybe 1 to 2% of the time it'll hit the bullseye, right? What kind of Litmus does, and say the 100 darts took like X amount of effort, right, to throw. So how I kind of thought about it is, or say you're 10 feet away from the dartboard. What Litmus actually does is it takes that user, and how I kind of explained it was, it takes the user that's 10 feet away and brings them to maybe 2 or 3 feet away, because now you're working on 100 different things, or obviously much lower, that is much quicker to market. And what that does is also, it also kind of at the same time increases your accuracy kind of percentage or success rate, right? And so it's, taking it from the 1 to 2%, it might take it to more 10 to 15%, right? So end of the day, the outcome of getting more darts at the bullseye increase drastically. And I think how I kind of got buy-in, I think end of the day, right? It really comes down to like starting small, right? So take one big feature that the exec team, your team, that you think is going to have a high impact, but there's still like a lower confidence that it will actually succeed. Break that down into 2 different initiatives on your roadmap. Maybe the Litmus version of it, and then the full-fledged version of it, and then work on the Litmus version of it, and just align. Does this Litmus version actually give us a good signal that the full-fledged version will actually be successful, right? And I think that would be probably the best way to kind of get buy-in from everyone.
Seems a lot of it is also about de-risking things early versus waiting till the end. Kunal, this has been really fascinating learning about Litmus. As we wrap up, I'm going to ask you just a couple of fun questions. We like to ask every guest at least a couple of these. What's one contrarian product belief that you hold, and something that maybe many product managers will disagree with you on?
Yeah, I think one, based on, I think going through Litmus and I kind of think about the world of product, right? What I think is most PMs should actually focus less on product discovery, but more time on decision quality. And I think most people would really kind of identify that, hey, make sure that you're obsessed about, the problem. You spend weeks and, days researching and really identifying what we should build, right? I think that's still important, but can you get there much more quickly and focus more on the micro decisions and the macro decisions that you're going to make once you really identified the problem you're solving and how you're going to solve the problem.
I love it because almost everybody talks about, hey, spend a lot of time with customers, really focus on the problem. In fact, I just did a roundup episode and it was one of the core themes. I like you add this twist. How do we do it really fast? And then we make sure we make the right decisions based on this. I'll ask you one last question. So what's the recent aha moment you had in your own leadership journey?
I think probably one aha moment is, I think that most leadership or management problems are actually like sequencing problems. I think teams don't actually fail because they're wrong or they've solved the wrong problem, but they actually fail because they do the right things in the wrong order. So I think it's not like, hey, my real job as a manager, right, isn't to just have better ideas, right? I think it's also like, how do you sequence those decisions? So clarity, comes before, I think speed is one, right? And speed then comes before scaling. I think that's kind of a critical piece as you kind of think about sequencing or phasing what should the next 10 steps be for this specific feature. And then I think when you get the order right, then, who this is for, how it ships, how it lands, execution in general just end up getting dramatically easier. I think those are, that's kind of been a learning or aha moment I've had. As kind of a manager over the last, year or two.
I love the contrarian point of view. It's about sequencing rather than you're going in the wrong direction. Kunal, thank you so much. This was incredible. And thank you for being so generous with your insights.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, and, excited and pick me once you guys have your first win. Would love to celebrate together, and we can, maybe interview you for a newsletter.
Absolutely. And tell me more, where should people, if they want to learn more from you, where do they find you?
Yeah, I'd say come to insidergrowthhq.com. And that's where every 2 weeks, we'll publish a set of 3 case studies that have actually tactically worked well to increase a revenue adjacent metric. And the feedback we've heard is it's really easy. I think the exciting part is you can read, it only takes 5 to 10 minutes to read, and you can then quickly figure out, how would I apply this to my next sprint or my next quarter roadmap? It's kind of immediate kind of impact and value.
I'll be sure for anybody watching this on YouTube or listening on Spotify or any of the other platforms, the website as well as Kunal's LinkedIn will be in the show notes, so you can go find it there. Thanks again, Kunal. And to our listeners, if you got value from this episode, just take a second to rate it, review it, and share it with one product manager in your network. That's how we grow. And if you're looking for help in stepping into your next leadership role, make sure to check out intentionalproductmanager.com. Until next time, everyone, stay intentional, stay ambitious, and go get that win using the Litmus framework. Thank you again, Kunal.
Thank you.
Hey, be sure to check out our website at intentionalproductmanager.com to see how you can level up in your career.